Please join us in welcoming Neil Batra to the stage.
Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. I'm Neil Batra. I'm Deloitte's Future of Health leader. And I'm so thrilled you could join us today. We've got a fabulous panel. And we're going to talk about the forces reshaping health. Before we get into it, I thought what I would do is set the scene a little bit and share the Deloitte point of view on where this is all going. And then the conversation that'll follow will get into some of the nuance as we move through this story. So, visually see in front of you, the Wave Zero legacy health system is essentially the health system we've been at for the last 70 plus years post-World War II. It's independent sectors all looking to maximize their own returns. It's a consumer that's on the fringes of the overall ecosystem. And while we're all out there trying to do the right thing for the individual in many cases is a secondary part of the story. The consumer is a secondary part of the story. What we've observed from other transformations in other industries is that the way transformations occur is when you have pressure from the outside coming in and it requires the incumbent structures to respond. And that's exactly where we think we are today, this fragmentation moment of Wave One, this proliferation of wildly ambitious, creative, technically advanced, consumer-centric ideas that, frankly, you see a lot of at CES this year, last year, and the previous 4 or 5 years. And that's where we are. We are in this really interesting fragmentation moment where so many novel ideas are playing out, some of which are direct competitors to the legacy structure. So think virtual health solutions as challenges to classic brick-and-mortar, in-person provision of care. But then you've got lots of novel solutions where the classic system never really got to it in a meaningful way at all. Mental health issues, wellness issues, hyper early disease detection issues, et cetera. So all of that's happening in that fragmentation moment. Where we think it's now going to go is this industry reassembly. And we think reassembly is where the magic happens and where the value is going to be created, because it's essentially where your incumbents are going to gobble up some of these new movers, these new emergers. And whether you want to call it an acquisition or a combination, whatever the case is, you have a fundamental transformation of the power structure from these classic sectors that were separate to now these sectors that are intertwined, interrelated, and integrated with all the great innovation that's occurred in the fragmentation moment. And that's what we're going to call reassembly. And then what happens after that is this notion of an age of biology, where all of that now happens, but it happens at an N of 1 personalized level. So in some ways, you can think about the journey from left to right as being rule of thumb health to N of 1 health. And that's the journey we believe all of this is on, and we think it's a 20-year journey, and we think we're roughly midway, maybe not quite. So Deloitte's recently released a Future of the Health Consumer paper to sort of articulate this point of view. And the heart of our point of view in this paper that's just come out, and we'll give a QR code here in a moment that you'll be able to pull down during the course of the session. The heart of the paper is essentially the point that you see here, which is historically consumers have had limited knowledge, but tremendous opinions about where they want their health to go, though they may not have the health literacy to express it with real precision, but they are opinionated. And the healthcare professional is really the central figure that monitors, observes, and drives the activity. What we're arguing is in 2030 and beyond, the consumer is going to elevate to the CEO of their own health, armed with information that's spinning off of wearables, nearables, other devices, other data being translated for them through AI applications that make it possible for laymen to maybe understand really complex dynamics. And that moves the healthcare professional from somebody that was a central figure to one that is now maybe a co-pilot or a coach. And that is a radically profound comment, because you're now moving physicians and clinicians from the lead to a support role. And we're not saying this is going to happen overnight, and we're certainly not saying this is going to happen for all therapies or all therapy areas immediately, right? Cancer is a much more complicated dynamic than maybe, say, early stage diabetes. So we're not suggesting at all this happens overnight, but it is a direction that we believe this is all going to flow into. And if that's true, what it means is the consumers ever more at the center of their health, their view of what that means, and their definition is going to be much more than just sick care. It's going to be a radically broader definition of health that includes wellness and well-being and encompasses things like mental health, emotional health, along with physical health. So in that paper, what you'll see are a couple of really interesting data points. The increased financial strain, year-on-year increase in per capita out-of-pocket healthcare costs rising radically. 1 in 3 consumers feeling less prepared to handle the unexpected costs in care. And a decrease in trust. 80% of consumers wouldn't return to the same provider. 36% of consumers skipped or avoided care due to lack of trust. So you have real pressures in the system that are talking about, hey, if an alternative option comes along here, I might jump at it as a consumer. And so that's what you see on the right side. 57% have wearables to track health metrics. 51%, are likely to tell their physician that they disagree. I could tell you that number was much, much lower going back even 10 years ago. 48% are using Gen AI with health as a top reason to translate and help me inform what's going on within me. So we think this is primed for the transformation that we're talking about. And so, I'll bring our folks out here in a moment, but let me unpack this visual here for a moment. These are all, I think, call them jobs that consumers are handling or addressing when it comes to health. And you see the categories on the bottom, choices or decisions that run on their insights versus areas in which consumers call their own shots, or areas in which consumers are deciding based on their own experiences, or just the fact that they want to try new things. And it's driving really robust new choicing and what we're calling shoppable moments for consumers to explore and investigate and navigate health in ways that historically have just not been an option. And so this is a really interesting graph. You see the QR code up in the upper right corner. Please feel free to click on that, pull the paper down. And so with that sort of as the setup, I want to bring out our panelists here, a really tremendous group, and we'll have them join me on stage. Wonderful. Okay, so we're going to settle in. We have about 33 minutes or so to really get into this. So maybe before we get going, maybe each of you a quick comment about who you are, where you play, and we'll go like that.
Great. I'm Dorothy Kilroy, and I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Oura Ring.
My name's Christian Liu, and I'm the Director of Partnerships and Go-to-Market Strategy at Google Health.
I'm Tom Swanson. I lead marketing and strategy for healthcare at Adobe.
So I'm unbelievably excited to have the group of 3 join me here. And so we're going to get into this, and we're going to hit this from a couple angles. Question 1, and it's a theme that we've been hearing at CES for a number of years, which is it's all about the data. It's all about the data. Well, as we're reflecting on this, maybe Dor, we start with you. Is it still all about the data, or are we at the point where we have enough and it's about translating that data, or are we still somewhere in between?
Great question. I believe that we're at a point where it's not just about gathering the data anymore. I think it's about making the data sure that it's quality data, but also that it's relevant and actionable for the user. I think we've now entering that frame. I'm personally really excited about the move away from having a doctor have to interpret all your data, technology to have to interpret all your data, to you actually can be empowered to be, I think you called it the CEO of your own data, and being able to actually do that yourself. I think wearables are certainly making a strong case for that, literally having the data at your fingertips. But for a lot of people, they still don't know how to just interpret that data. And so we're going to have to make sure that it's really user-friendly in a way that they can actually action on it.
So Christian, do we have enough that if you have the interpretation tools, it becomes actionable?
I think we're definitely getting there this year. As I think about your first question of do we have enough data, I look at all of us on stage, and we all have at least one tracker or wearable on us, which is not necessarily true if you look back a few years. And so there's definitely a point where most people, or many people, are having the tools to track that data and information. And what's really key to that is making sure that no matter which device you have, no matter what number of wearables you have, you as a consumer or user have access to all of that information and can share it in the right way and can make sense to it. And so to your point around, do we have the tools to make sense of this information? I think it's a really exciting time because of generative AI and because of artificial intelligence. We've been able to see how our tool sets like Gemini, which is our latest large language model, can be applied to finding correlations in data, not only in one specific device or tracker, but across a swath of different data. And that's really exciting to me.
So Tom, from your seat and from the Adobe seat, you've got a very unique, I think, lens on the health space, because you're looking at, I think, a lot of enterprise infrastructure and a lot of the guts of what makes this go. In some cases, focus on the incumbents, but you're also, I know, playing with some of the upstarts. Thoughts on the data, thoughts on the AI element here to make sense of it?
No, I appreciate the context, Neil, because I was going to take a different tact, right? And instead of talking about consumer access to and use of data, I'm going to talk about like the incumbent payers and providers and the pharmaceutical companies, life sciences industry. I would argue that, of course, we have enough data, right, in those spaces. I mean, the healthcare industry as a whole has more data than any other industry. The question is, are you using the data in an appropriate way, right, and using it in a way that is actually of value to your consumers, right? Can you use that data to provide value, to provide, to build trust in order to enable your consumers to kind of be a proactive participant in their own wellness? Right, the data is there, right? But I think the biggest problem that we have as an industry is not using it in a timely manner, or being afraid to use it because of legal and regulatory constraints. When the consumers have made it painfully clear, right, that we want our doctors and our insurance companies and even our pharmaceutical companies to use our data to serve us. And so it's getting them over that hump of being comfortable using the data that they've got, I think, is the transition point where we are.
So maybe stay with you then, Tom, on that piece of it, which is, how do we get past this regulatory concern, this fear of doing wrong or the fear of misusing data? In my travels, organizations are so concerned about hacks and data leaks. And in many ways, it's in the way of the capturing and the insight generation and the interpretation and the tailoring of solutions, because they're covering their flank on the risk side of this. Mm-hmm. Do you see a way out of this in the moment, or do you think we're kind of still in this balancing act?
Well, I mean, of course I see a way out of it.
Well, tell us.
It's a matter of, first of all, getting your organization comfortable with the notion of using what is called protected health information. And then leveraging the technology that's available in order to help you use it in a compliant way, right? There's technology that's available that, secures the data from both a privacy and security perspective, like particularly where HIPAA is concerned, that you can govern, right? Who has access to the data? Mm-hmm. Who can use it in what way? And I think once you leverage that technology and you get over the organizational hurdle of being comfortable using it, it's a matter of then being transparent to your customers with what data you're collecting and how you intend to use it, right? And I think if you are transparent, use it only in that way, get their consent to use it, and then there's technology that can help you manage consent and, customer ID, so that you can attach that consent to a particular consumer one-to-one. Those are the kinds of things, right, that I think the technology's there, you get over it perceptually, right? And if you're transparent, you build trust, you get consent, you absolutely can do it. You can use it.
It's interesting because you're coming at it from a established incumbent lens. So Dora, maybe over to you. You are born around the consumer.
Right.
So is that the way forward from your perspective?
Yeah, I really believe that, especially in this era, will be very consumer-led in making some of these changes. And maybe to your point on sort of the regulatory space, we just believe strongly that sort of that consumer-led movement will be the thing to change it. I'll give you an example from Aura, maybe to highlight this. We partnered with a company, Natural Cycles, that is an FDA-cleared digital birth control solution. And the idea was to bring the temperature of Aura into their app so that you could then know what your fertility status is and decide your choices as a family. I think what's just really interesting about that is that there was a lot of regulatory red tape to get through. There was a lot with the FDA clearance, but what it was a movement from the consumers saying, hey, I want a better solution here. So I think you're right, Tom. I think like a lot of the incumbents like have kind of held onto the data and have created especially difficult regulatory hurdles to actually bring a consumer product to market like that. But I see just consumers pushing and demanding for more here, and I think that's what's actually going to change it.
So Christian, are you seeing that in your Google Health seat?
Yeah, absolutely, and I completely agree, right? Like, I think that the future of health is consumer-led, who expect a more mobile-first experience than what has traditionally been delivered through your phone, through wearables. I think having the ability for the consumer to have agency over their data is what's really critical here. And so being able to provide consent, being able to provide transparency, and then most importantly, value behind that data and the data sharing, I think is really critical, because then that will help push over consumers to really say, hey, I would like to share this data with companies. I would like to share this data with people in a privacy-respecting, secure way. And there's value associated with it. We see that now with some of the tools and technologies that we're building. So Health Connect, which is an API on Android, we have many partners that are on it. Aura is one of them. And it's one of those abilities to, in a turnkey way, set up data sharing across applications for health and wellness data. And advances like that, I think, are really critical to enable the user with their phone to control and share their data to whomever they would like, or turn off the sharing if that's what they would like. And that's a really interesting future that I see us progressing to. And that'll help us, I think, with those tools, get the consumer piece of this really going.
And so one of your earlier comments, you teased AI and LLMs. How does that fit into the sharing piece or in the regulatory privacy safety piece? Is that touching those places, or is it touching on interpretation and translation, which I think is where everyone's head goes?
Yeah.
But maybe the sexy stuff that's a little further out, I don't know.
I think it touches on all of those, but I also, because it's the sexy thing, I focus on this interpretation piece because it's just so interesting, right? Even a year ago, we couldn't necessarily throw in all of this data and say, what does it mean to me? But now you can. Yeah. You can throw it all into a large language model. It can predict the pieces, understand, and then in a really layperson's language, explain to you what's going on. You no longer need to be a machine learning scientist to understand the interpretation of the model. And that's so exciting for consumer applications, for any place where the consumer is really engaging with the technology. Yeah. And so I think that's a super exciting place for this to go. There's definitely other areas, like with regulatory compliance, with security, where AI is playing a huge role as well. And so I don't want to overlook that. But for me personally, I'm really excited about that interpretation.
So then let's flip the conversation. So we've talked a little bit technical in terms of the technologies that are available. Maybe, Dor, to you, let's talk about the consumer.
Right.
What is this emerging, rapidly transforming consumer that we're talking about? Because they look different every year that I look.
Yeah. I think the consumers are all at different states, right? There is certainly a more health-conscious consumer that is being more proactive about their health, and I don't think that's everybody yet. I do think that is changing as a shift, but I think in general we have still a long way to go in more literacy of health to the consumer. For the most part, and we just spoke about the data, but the data has been kind of held by the providers, not accessible, literally not in your hands or on your fingertip. So there's just been this absence of having that. And I think now consumers are at the point where they are looking to have something really personalized, right? We all know how we feel on a day-to-day basis, right? We wake up, we know how we feel, but we don't know what's going on inside our bodies necessarily. And so, you know, in maybe bygone years, we go to a doctor and we ask them to interpret. They're doing a one-time snapshot. They don't know how you've been over the last year. And so the best data is your own data comparing to you, not to the average, to you personally, and to be able to see then how those little micro experimentations can actually change your life. So I'm pretty bullish that like being able to give that personalization to the end user will help. I mean, I'll give an anecdote. We were talking backstage about the cable industry and how that's changing, and you think about your Netflix or your Spotify account and how personalized that is to you in a way that actually builds a lot of trust and loyalty, and you keep wanting to go back to that. I think we're at a moment where that could actually happen with our own health data.
So then, Tom, I'm putting you in the seat of maybe telling us what the enterprise players think. Do you think they understand the consumer the way Dora just explained the consumer, or do they think of this consumer in a more legacy, classic way, which is very different? More docile, willing to be led.
Yeah, I was hoping you were going to ask me the question about legal and regulatory being sexy. No, I actually think the answer to your question is yes and no, right? It depends on the organization. I mean, the enterprises that Adobe works with, we see from kind of the disruptive startup that is not burdened with kind of legacy thinking around it being very provider-centric, right? They are very focused on their consumer, right? And they intentionally use the language consumer as opposed to patient or member or healthcare professional, right? Because it's an important mind shift to be thinking about your customers as consumers, right? And that they come to the table with expectations around what is a digital experience going to look and feel like? How much personalization based on data do I expect, right? And as consumers of Netflix and Spotify, or it doesn't matter, your personal banking or buying plane tickets, right? I mean, these are all things that are digital first engagements, and your preferences are known, right? You have provided consent for them to use the data in order to offer up the best possible experience to you, right? And I think that's what the healthcare industry has the opportunity to do. In answer to your question, Neil, there are far too many of these incumbent enterprises that still think things are going to go back to the way they were pre-pandemic, right? But the pandemic was literally a paradigm shift in healthcare, because what it did was it forced consumers into alternative channels to just get the same care, right, that they were used to. And once they got into those alternative or digital channels and they were able to experience telehealth or virtual care or something that was more convenient, had greater access, more transparency in how you were interacting, as a consumer, why would you ever go back to that kind of black box way that we used to engage our healthcare ecosystem, where you're reliant upon an expert to interpret the data, and then you either take their advice or you don't. This idea of being far more proactive and engaged and proactively managing your wellness based on the information that you have at your fingertips, or based on the digitally personalized experiences that you're getting from your healthcare ecosystem. I mean, I think this is the most exciting time to be a healthcare consumer, because the change is right now, right? And as consumers, all of us have the opportunity to implement and drive that change.
So it's so odd that we have a group up here and we all are in strong agreement that this consumer-led transformation is underway. So maybe the question is, what's in the way? What's the drag on it? What's preventing it from happening faster or with more intensity? And maybe, Christian, we'll start with you on that lens, because you're in the guts of this thing. What are the drags on this transformation?
I'll focus on two things. Hopefully I remember what they are as I talk through the first one. I think the first one to me is data interoperability controlled by the consumer. We've not had that in the past, right? Like, as Dora mentioned, a lot of the data is locked up. It's not available. Consumers, even if they wanted to share the data, have no idea exactly how they would do that.
Right.
And that's slowly changing with the capabilities that are being unlocked and unleashed. And I think that's where some of the roadblocks have been, is actually being able to get individuals to say, I would like to share my data and take it from this provider, this application, this company that isn't serving my needs, and transition it to someone else that is better at serving my needs. And that I think is one of the things that is happening. We've not been able to do that over the past, but tools and technology is leading us down that pathway, so I'm excited about that. The other piece is on the incentives perspective, which all goes back to how much do you pay out of pocket for something. And for many consumers, that cost is so hidden that you, one, don't have the information to make the choice, and then two, once you have some of the information to make the choice, you can't necessarily do so in the appropriate way because you're unclear about the cost associated with the quality of the thing that you're getting. So then how do you drive at a consumer revolution if the consumer doesn't have all the data to make that decision? I think those are some of the barriers that I would see as challenges to getting us there.
So maybe just follow up on that second point, because it's the first time we've talked about cost at all.
Sure.
Which I know folks are in the audience probably saying, talk about the money. So how do we address that issue, which is the cost to me now as a consumer, the legacy structure is a little bit hidden. I pay a premium, it covers some things, and I have to go out of pocket some other things. There's some things that I consume, like food, that probably is a healthcare spend that I don't view as a healthcare spend.
Correct.
And increasingly, as I wear smart devices and wearables, I will know those are healthcare spends because I know what they do to me. So how do we unpack and unravel the financial aspect of this? Or do you think maybe there's no real clear structure to that just yet?
It's a really tough question, considering exactly what you said, right? The money that I spend on exercise, the money that I spend on food, the money that I spend on wearables isn't covered by insurance.
Right.
Yet when I go to a primary care doctor, that is covered by insurance. When I go to a preventative care visit, my plan has it for free. So how do you square that for a consumer? How do I then prioritize what I'm spending my time on and how I look at these, the inputs that are coming into my life? I think it's really challenging. The one area where I have hope is that there's more and more data for the individual to make those decisions on. And so by that I mean I can track my food intake for the most part. And I can understand if it's making me feel better or worse. I can see it in some of the data. I can track my exercise. I can see whether or not it's making me feel better or worse. And so from that perspective, there is some value to dollars being spent that you can interpret as a consumer. And maybe that is the place where we start. And then we figure out where we go from there.
That's interesting. So Dor, maybe to you then, you're living with this consumer, you're asking them to consume your product, and maybe just the question to you, which is the way you position yourself with the consumer, do you position it as a health spend, or is it a lifestyle spend, or is it a wellness spend, or is it something else?
Yeah, I mean, and those terms mean different things to different consumers.
Yes.
Just quite frankly, kind of like the way that you've broken it down, I think was really clear, Christian. I think we still think we're in the early inning of this, and this is really about a lifestyle wellness spend. But increasingly, because you're getting this opportunity to do this personalization and sort of experiment on yourself all the time, so whether it's the food you eat, the alcohol that you drink or don't drink, the caffeine that you may have had this morning, whether you took a late flight in last night and lost sleep, whatever it is, right, you're starting to see what are those effects physiologically on you, right? So how does that change your heart rate? How does that change your stress levels? How does that change your HRV, right? And you have all of this like data back on the choices that you're making. And so I think that starts to then shift you into, this is more medical, this is health, this is preventative, this is something that I care about for my life. So, I think we're starting to see that shift happen.
Yeah, interesting. Tom, any other additional thoughts on this part of the
I kind of want to go back to something that Christian said about the costs in the current system being hidden, right? Because one of the things that I find fascinating, right, is that kind of an unintended consequence of the Affordable Care Act is that the vast majority of us now are in these very high deductible plans for those of us that are insured, say, through our employers or something like that. We did a study with our partners at Change Healthcare a year or so ago that indicated that 80% of those that are covered through these high deductible plans never actually hit their deductibles, right? And I mean, I am a father of 2 teenagers, right? And we didn't, thank goodness, hit our deductible last year. So what does that mean psychologically from a consumer's perspective? It's, well, I paid all of this money in my premiums and I'm still paying out of pocket, right? There's a lot of hidden benefits in there to being covered, right? But the perception is I'm still paying out of pocket. So what else as a consumer would I buy without shopping around in order to find the best value, the best access, the best convenience, all of that. And one of the things that we've seen is that about half of that 80%, right, is willing to step outside their plan coverage in order to see a doctor immediately, right, to get that convenience or to get a better experience, or there's other value drivers. So one of the things that I think is particularly interesting is this notion of the healthcare consumer kind of being a captive audience. I think that's changing very rapidly, right? Which is forcing these incumbents to compete for dollars and eyeballs and loyalty in a way that they've never had to compete before. And I think that's a real opportunity for consumers to drive this change that we've been talking about, is because you can actually literally vote with your dollars, right, and vote with your feet as to who's giving you the best healthcare experience.
So it makes me want to go back to this page here, which talks about historically the health professional was the central figure. The consumer had limited medical or health knowledge, but they had opinions. And what we're arguing is that consumer now becomes the CEO of their own health journey, and the health professional, in this case the clinician, maybe the physician, goes to more of a co-pilot or coach. Is this a bridge too far, or maybe Tom, I'll sort of come back to you so you can piggyback off of your previous comments, or are we really heading down this direction? And do you think physicians will let this happen? Which is a very real question, actually.
Yeah,
for the power structure.
Yeah, for the physicians in the room, forgive me. But when you were asking kind of what is the drag on the change, right? Or why is it going slower than we as consumers would want it to go? And I think the physicians or the clinicians are a big part of that, right? Because they have, kind of established their way of doing business, right? And it's very provider-centric. And of course, they're reluctant necessarily to change that. So, but I think that ultimately, if you buy into this notion that they're having to compete for consumers now, like maybe they didn't have to before, they've got to start paying attention, right, to this notion of what is it that my customer, and I'm using the term intentionally, right, not my patient, it's what is it that my customer wants from me, right? How can I differentiate myself? What in terms of access and convenience or transparency of pricing or whatever it is, can I provide, right? Or how can I utilize the data that I've got at my fingertips to demonstrate to Tom that I understand him better than anyone else will and can provide the value that he's looking for.
And so, Dora, as the Oura Ring produces all of this data,
Sure.
I imagine you have some clinicians who are like, that's amazing.
Sure.
Give me access.
Yeah.
You have some who are feeling threatened.
Yep.
Do you have a lens on, is that shifting? Why are folks feeling the way they feel?
We definitely see it shifting more in favor of the data. I think I have a lot of empathy for physicians. I grew up in Ireland and my mom was a doctor, and she would talk about how you would go in once a year. She was in general medicine. You would go in once a year and you would have this maybe 30 minutes if you were lucky. You had a little more time in Ireland. And you would get, you would have to sort of like opine on the health of this individual with just a snapshot in time. And I think that was a real unfair disadvantage to the clinician, really. And so just in that example, I think giving them continuous data to be able to see that, I think makes the physicians in this case kind of have a bigger superpower. And so I actually am more hopeful that like working with them than against them is actually going to be what's valuable here. I think that interrogating the integrity of the data and making sure that it is clinical grade is key, certainly when it comes to wearables. But I'm more bullish that like we're going in the right trend with the physicians. I'm also hopeful on your chart here at 2030. I'm more hopeful that we're going to go faster.
Yeah.
I think that having knowledge with the consumer and having that consumer-led movement, working with the physicians, I think it's going to be a faster pace. I'll take the optimistic view.
I love it. I love the optimism. Christian, do you see clinicians helping this along, being, increasingly adopting data coming from sources that are not their own?
Yeah, I think I'm blessed to work with a lot of clinicians that are very forward-thinking, particularly at Google Health. And so what's really exciting to me is I find those folks that are really interested in being a coach. They want to work with their consumers, their customers, their patients in thinking about what their goals are. And the parallel that I think of is in financial services, which we've all discussed as well, where financial advisors are there to work with you on your financial goals. And my father is a financial advisor, my wife is in the business as well, and so I get a little bit more insight into that world. But it's really interesting to see how they work really closely with their clients and customers in terms of achieving their financial goals. And I would see that similarly in the healthcare space. Your doctors are there, and the team is really there to help you achieve your health and wellness goals. And I think that's where, as things shift, consumers will start to look for that. And if they have the means to shift their dollars, their data, they might end up doing so.
It's a great parallel. Yeah, it's a great parallel. So maybe last question, we're just under 4 minutes here. Let's talk trust for a moment. We haven't really touched on it. We know historically trustworthy institutions and sources have been undermined in many cases for credible reasons, in many cases not for credible reasons. But you have a fundamental problem with trust and understanding and believing data, the sources, the integrity, and your ability to action it. How does that fit into this puzzle here? Does it matter? Will it work itself out on its own? Are there specific actions that can be taken from your respective organizations? Any comments? I'll sort of leave that open to the floor. Yep.
Well, I'll go. I actually think we've been kind of bad-mouthing the incumbents a little bit here.
That may be my fault.
The healthcare ecosystem. That's all right.
Okay.
But I think they actually have a bit of an advantage where trust is concerned, right? Because they are proven participants, right, or proven partners in terms of healthcare provision, in terms of your insurance company. Maybe you're a pharmaceutical user and you've had good results as a result of a particular brand, right? So you have a sense of loyalty, right, and trust with these incumbents. But I think, so if the incumbents actually start to embrace the technology and utilize the data in order to personalize experiences, I think they have a big opportunity. But that opportunity is fleeting. The window of that opportunity is closing as more and more disruptors and upstarts that are not burdened with, like I said earlier, legacy thinking around being provider-centric as opposed to consumer-centric. People are going to move, right? And consumers are beginning to trust more and more kind of the technology around the collection of the data. Now, do they trust this gizmo, right, as much as they trust their doctor? Maybe, maybe not, right? But the doctor has to, embrace the changes, utilize the data that's available, and then capitalize on that trust, right? Or they're going to lose these customers.
Yeah, I'm with Tom on this one. I think something that we say is that healthcare moves at the speed of trust. And so without that trust-built relationship, we can't move as fast. And having the incumbents with their legacy of trust relationship with the consumers is really critical. And there's a lot that they can do there to work within the industry and with the newcomers to advance where we're going in healthcare.
Yeah, I'll build on it. Trust is hard to earn and it's easy to lose. And I think in this industry, I think that trust will be won by amazing customer experiences. No. And they will be very unforgiving when they are bad.
It's interesting from the Deloitte perspective. It's the one area of innovation that we anticipated that we're not seeing nearly enough activity in. And that may be a function of it's hard, and maybe a function of it requires a certain level of sophistication on data and technology and interoperability to allow for it. It's not really clear to us why it's not happening, but it's the one area where we're seeing real weakness in terms of the fragmentation moment and the ideation that we're seeing everywhere else. Okay, with that, enormous thanks to the three of you. Thank you for joining me. Tom, Christian, Dor, thanks so much.
Thank you.